We are now live with the May 20th edition of the Node.js modules team. We've got 7 folks on the call and a full agenda, so we're going to get right to it. First off, on here, we've got CJS exports detection. This is issue number 33461. This was opened by Guy, who is on the call. So Guy, would you like to introduce this issue?
Yeah, so this has come out of a long process that's taken many years. We've had many discussions around how to do named exports for CommonJS modules. And in the last meeting, it seemed like we were making some progress on getting some agreement behind a parsing approach, having previously made no agreement on any other approaches before. So that was quite exciting to see. Bradley went and put together a project that did a parse with Acorn and then analysis of the source, and we were collaborating on that. And then as we went through that process, it became clear that performance was also incredibly important with this parsing. Even for small sources, if it's going to take 10 or 20 milliseconds to parse a CommonJS file to work out what the exports are, you might end up, say, for example, if you load 100 CommonJS modules from ES modules, you've now got 1 or 2 seconds added to your startup time, potentially. So that's where I thought maybe we could do it with a much simpler Lexa that doesn't do full scope analysis. And if we could get the same kind of level of results. And so based on Bradley's work and the sort of how we'd gone through on the test cases with that, I was then able to put together a simple, basically just a Lexa, which is based off an existing project which does extraction of ES module detection, syntax detection, and it detects just a few patterns. I'll actually just post the link to the patterns that it supports here. Let me just get it. I've just pasted that in the chat. It basically looks for explicit exports dot tokens, or an exports with a string in a bracket, or module.exports assignment. And then because there are some Webpack bundles, for example, if people Webpack their code before publishing, I also added a special pattern for Webpack and confirmed with Tobias that it would be valid. And the benefit of this lexing approach that doesn't do full scope analysis is it works on UMD wrappers that otherwise would require much more advanced analysis to work out where the exports was. And this came out of discussion with Wesley at the last meeting. He mentioned TypeScript do something similar, only at the top level, but this does the full source. So there's quite a bit of complexities to it. Hopefully people have had time to dig into it a little bit. Jeffrey ran some initial results on it against the top 1,000 modules in the NPM registry. And the results that he got from that, I'm just looking, he's posted in that issue, 62% of packages had all CommonJS named exports detected. 5% of packages had some, but not all CommonJS named exports detected. And 33% didn't get any named exports detection. So if the parser fails or if it doesn't detect anything, we just sort of fall back to the standard import default case that we have currently today. And a lot of those cases come down to singleton patterns, or where someone creates a variable like my module, which could be a function or a class or something like that, and then they do a module.exports assignment. They assign it to modules.exports, and so we don't detect those patterns. But otherwise, it takes the existing situation today where we don't have any named exports, and it makes something that seems like it's largely useful. I personally think this would be quite nice to be able to ship. And it would be interesting to hear what people think about it. I know Gus had some concerns, but I'd be interested to hear if there's anyone else we haven't heard from who has any opinions on this, or had a chance to look into it.
So I have my hand raised. I made a comment on the issue, but unfortunately I don't have time to like run the alternate results myself. But the PR proposes using the dunder ES module field like Babel uses or Babel produces. But the numbers that Jeffrey came up with don't use that. So I would be really interested to see those numbers for your proposed implementation specifically, whatever it happens to be. But the other thing that occurs to me is if you're looking for things like exports dot, that's not going to work when the named exports are properties on something that isn't the original object. Meaning, if they do module.exports.foo equals separately, if they module.exports equals a function, and then that function has static properties on it, which is also not an uncommon pattern, I suspect. So it'd be interesting to, like, in general, I'm on the side of like, we should, as long as the heuristic we come up with is stable, we should, and ideally we can like lint for it, so people can help make their packages follow it. That like, I'd rather ship something than nothing, but at the same time, I do want to make sure that we can maximize the common patterns we include, so that like you really have to, like, I'd love to have a world where the only time named exports don't just work is when you're doing something weird you probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. And like a function with properties, for example, or module.exports equals an object with properties is a totally valid thing to do. So I want to try and get an understanding of how well we're meeting that.
So it's worth mentioning just a couple of things related to that. Firstly, for packages like React, they have a module.exports equals require index file. And we support that pattern, again, as discussed with Wesley at the last meeting. We do support module.exports.property. But yes, as you described, those other cases probably fall under the 33% that don't necessarily get exports. And this kind of touches on the reason why Gus has currently put a block on this. Is he claims that if you have an existing module that does exports dot, and you were to refactor it to not do exports dot anymore, you wouldn't know as the author of the CommonJS module that you're making a breaking change for your ES module consumers. And so for that reason, he doesn't want to see this landing. And so maybe we can try and work through some of those questions in more detail. I do think it would be nice to try and make progress on this sooner rather than later, because it's something that has been going on for a long time, and it would be nice to decide if we are going to make progress on it or not.
So I had my hand up. A couple things I would love to add here, kind of like all things depending. We did just land in 12, or no, in 14.4, is it? What was the latest one? Checking with NVM, 14.3. That's my easiest way. Thank you, Jordan, for that great tool. So 14.3 just landed the updated change to the errors. So when you try to import a CommonJS module with named exports, it actually now prints out for you an explicit error saying, hey, you've tried to import a CommonJS module with named exports. It's not supported, and even gives you the code sample of what you can copy and paste to use alternatively. I'm not saying that this is a sufficient replacement, but I think it is a good step forward from what the status quo was. Having worked upstream in a couple different projects that have worked on writing these kind of wrapper modules, it is a pain in the butt. It's like a non-trivial amount of labor to put this together, and then it becomes actually extra complicated to test, because now what you need to do is if you want to actually test that interface, you need to write like you need to write a special part of your test suite that can run ESM code natively, and then you also need to be able to like version sniff or be able to sniff support, which is stuff that like myself and Targos and Jordan's worked on it as well, like creating like modules to make that easier. But it's a non-trivial amount of extra work, not just to add the wrapper, but to test the wrapper and make sure that the wrapper is supported. It also means that you kind of need to introduce package exports field in order to do it, which then opens up a whole other bunch of things. It's not perfect. I mean, it is definitely doable, but it is a lot of effort. And I think to the point of some of the module authors who have kind of like 500, 1,000 modules that they maintain, I think Jordan is maybe one of those folks. It is a lot of work to do that across all of the modules that they support. And then the option kind of becomes, hey, like maybe I just won't do it. Or alternatively, hey, I have to do a lot of labor. This is obviously like a non-issue for modules that just export functions as like the main export, but that's not every module. So I guess that's like, in short, I understand why supporting this is very compelling. But at the same time, I think that especially with the clear warnings that we have right now, it's at least a lot better than it was. And even just things like the package JSON stuff, which we'll get up to later, I think that the status quo of today can be significantly improved with better documentation and better errors, but that doesn't make less labor for the module authors. So I do think that this is worth continuing to explore. But to be blunt, I'm not 100% convinced that it's worth all the additional complexity. It's definitely a balance. To be clear, this is not like a -1 at all. It's probably more like a ±0 or neutral. But I guess, Guy, to sum all that up, because that was just like a lot of context maybe and not a lot of substance, I would be really interested to try to figure out, like, is the complexity that we're introducing and are the edge cases that we would potentially be creating worth it as a trade-off, especially if we have clearer error messages and documentation, A. And then B, and unfortunately, I don't think Gus is on the call, so he can't chime in, but do we think that it's actually possible to get this in a place where we could alleviate the existing blocks? Because something I would not want to see happen is too much time spent on this problem space and energy spent on the problem space to have it not land, mostly just because that's like super demotivating and not a great use of time. So with that being said, not my place to tell people where to put time. But if we really feel like it doesn't have a future, it's probably better to just kind of settle that before doing too much extra labor. I will take the silence.
I mean, just speaking for Gus's point a little bit, I mean, adding exports is a breaking change, and I'm working on a tool to make it easier to avoid doing that by accident, but like it's still a breaking change potentially. And similarly, adding Babel is a breaking change unless you're very careful about your entry points. And it is, I am okay with like something like that. Like that's already the case, right? Those things are breaking changes. And so you kind of just have to be aware of it or wait for someone to complain. It would be unfortunate if adding this nice feature, even partially, increased the cases where things were accidental breaking changes. And I think that is Gus's, I think Gus wouldn't use the word unfortunate. He would probably use a word more like unacceptable based on his comments. And that's, I think that's where, that's my sense of his motivation for his objection. And I would find that very unfortunate, and I would prefer to make it to avoid that. So like, it would probably also be useful if we want to continue pursuing it, figuring out how can we persuasively show that we're not making the accidental breaking change landscape worse.
So, I mean, what drove a lot of this work was a lot of the initial feedback that we were getting from ESM is that, of course, people expect this to work, and then when it doesn't, that's an issue, and that it works in bundlers. In theory, we can add this change at any point in future, and it would be non-breaking. But there is one aspect of this PR that is breaking, and that is the support for the ES module flag. Because if a module has the ES module flag and a default export, under this PR, we will make that export the main export, so that it exactly supports Babel workflows. And this was something Jan wanted, was that if you were to progressively move to real ES modules on an app that was using Babel, you'd hit this problem if you change your modules one by one. And you don't want to be doing import CJS from CJS.default when it's already got an ES module flag. So that was his argument. That cannot be changed once modules, once these workflows become more solidified. So that aspect of the PR, if we don't land it soon, that aspect would have to be dropped if we did want to be able to come back to this in future.
So I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, that we kind of need to get Gus in this conversation if we want to move it forward. Because we could try to speak for him, but like we really can't. Separate from that, perhaps like out of band and issues or one-to-one guy, you can maybe follow up with him so it's not like stuck on these calls. It doesn't seem to me like, and correct me if I'm wrong, is anyone else who's on the call right now objecting to this or have strong negative feelings about this approach?
I just want to make sure that we get accurate data that matches what the PR is going to do, so that we know what we're getting ourselves into. And like, I'm really appreciate Jeffrey's work getting the data that we have, and I wish I had time to help massage it further. But I would prefer to see that data before the PR lands. But that's not an objection to the PR.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now,
and I definitely appreciate the fact that we can move forward with this, and also in the future move forward with something more complete on top of it as an improvement, if we can.
Well, I am a little concerned that the numbers aren't as high as I'd like. I mean, having, accurately detecting more than half of CommonJS packages is certainly impressive, but I think it was something like 2/3 were detected, or maybe a little more than 70% if you have to say some but not all exports. But that still leaves something like a little over a quarter of packages where we don't detect them correctly. So my concern is just like, I think it starts to be like what Gus is saying, is that this starts to feel like a little, almost like hit or miss. Like if I'm a average user, whether the package I'm trying to import is going to work,
I think it's worth remembering that's already sort of the status quo. But I think it would help to know how many of those 33% are would typically be used as require module, and then that's the instance that you have. Because just because we don't detect static properties on classes doesn't mean it's not correctly behaving, because you probably you wouldn't necessarily want static class properties as exports.
It's also probably worth noting the 33% that aren't supported. One of the ones that was labeled as not supported is Lodash. And Lodash is notable for relying on the ESM package because its sources are actually ESM. There might be something we could do there to improve that.
There are a lot of big names in the not supported list, for sure. Now, granted, these are like the most popular NPM packages, so there's also like, these are the ones that are most likely to get updated. So it's sort of like, it's It's almost like these aren't the ones we should be worrying about in a sense, but like, I don't know.
So two things really quickly. Corey and Jan have their hands up. I'd like to give them an opportunity to speak. And just because we have other things that are on the agenda and we likely can't wrap this one up today anyways, I'd love to time box this to about another 5 minutes. So Corey, you're up.
So I just wanted to say I'm neutral on this. I'm not a strong opinion one way or another. One comment about the not supporting assigning an object to modules.export. That's actually pretty much how I write every CJS module. So I'll have function, whatever, a bunch of functions. And then at the bottom of the source, I'll have modules.export equals with a list of properties, shorthand matching the functions. So I'm not sure if that's something that could be improved on in the future, or if I'm just using an uncommon pattern, but I just wanted to comment on that.
The object literal assignment to module.exports is a case that could be improved on, like Wesley says, something that could be additive. We do have to be careful that we don't remove, the grammar has to be fully backwards compatible, but that would be a case that could be improved on, yes.
I mean, that's a pattern I use as well. I mean, my hope with all of this was also to start identifying, if we had a list of packages that don't work, we could then be like, okay, so are there any common patterns in these packages that we could add support for to up this percentage? So.
Jan, you're up.
Yeah, can you hear me? I hope so. From my side, speaking of the 33%, and I think it's a question that got also asked in the thread, I'm less concerned about the 2/3 versus 1/3, as long as the 2/3 include every single package that is transpiled from ESM, because I think that is the one where it actually is a fundamental difference to the upgrade story. I'm personally less concerned about handling random packages that people have written by hand.
Well, and maybe a solution there then is only address the ones that were Babel output.
I think that's a bigger. There's a separate question. I have voiced in the past that I would be in favor of that, because it would clearly scope it to things that we would reasonably expect to have an ESM equivalent, so that there is an actual upgrade path between the two, where it would be a considerable risk. And I think that is something that Gus also has not addressed in his comments, so there might be just a misunderstanding. Gus treats this as an optional feature that doesn't fundamentally change something, and I think it does. I think Gaia's put me badly. I think it fundamentally changes certain upgrades that are currently not possible to do safely, where people cannot enable native ESM for their packages because they are in a package tree and they would break their dependencies if they don't do it in the exact perfect order. And I think Jordan mentioned earlier that you want to see some more data potentially before you would be confident in supporting this direction. Is there some comment or somewhere where you kind of just an overview, bullet points of the kinds of things that you definitely want to see, or is it something that already exists or something you could write up?
I mean, yeah, there's some discussion in that thread. Like Jeffrey has his post about the numbers, and then I had a question. Like there's a back and forth there about it. Okay. But in general, it's I want to know what the proposed implementation's impact is going to be, because we are going to have to all in various ways know what to tell people. And so if we can look at the data and be like, well, here is like, we know what the heuristic is in the PR, but if we can say, here is the like effective heuristic, like what the actual like real life consequences of it, then we can describe those relatively succinctly, hopefully, and then tell people how to mitigate the problem.
Well, that would be, I think, the goal of the end of it would be like to add something to the docs. That's like, if you define your exports in any of these ways, Babel, blah, 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 and then
Right.
it will be supported. And then with the implication being, if you,
Right.
other than this, it won't. If I could just
Right,
respond to
and-
one thing from,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
should raise my hand. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just
really
going to say
quickly,
from Jan's
sorry,
point.
quick point of
Oh, go
order.
ahead.
Just a quick time check. We still do have quite a few agenda items, 3 agenda items in particular that are, well, 2 that require some time. And we've spent over half the meeting on this already. So let's do like another 3 minutes, but at 3:35, I'd really like us to move on.
If I could just say one thing, I'd rather not scope this specifically to Babel transpiled packages, because I feel like those are the most likely to be updated to real ESM or ESM wrappers, because they're already written in ESM or faux ESM or whatever. It's like, this is kind of most useful for the really old packages that are pure CommonJS, that are still CommonJS, may never get updated to ESM. So.
I think I already said that I think the opposite is true. I think this makes the biggest difference for packages that are authored in ESM, because for them, it actually affects the upgrade path. If the package is old and will not be updated, there's no problem of just using the default export, and it will never break.
And also some of the concerns are about a heuristic shifting over time. And then like, and if we pick a clear boundary, like it seems reasonable to me that packages that were authored in CJS only are expected to be consumed the way CJS works, which is there's a single default export and nothing else. Whereas if you authored your package in ESM, it makes sense that you would assume people can consume the named imports from it. You know, but either way, like if we have a clear boundary somewhere that's not going to change over time, and we're just going to fix bugs in it, or you know, maybe I don't know, expand it or something, then that seems like a better place to
I
be.
think we're talking about different users. Like I'm thinking of the end users consuming these packages. I think Jan is, I'm assuming, is thinking of the authors of these packages. So maybe that's why, maybe that'll help break it down.
I think
guess,
it's the difference between the end user being completely broken because the package enabled native LSM versus the end user being slightly inconvenienced. So I'm also thinking about the end user, but I'm thinking about the end user having a broken build because a package added exports.
Okay, I think we are at time on this one. Seems like there's a lot more to discuss still. Thanks everyone for being so thoughtful about this, and Jeff, thanks for going through and doing that research. That really is helpful in making these decisions. The next issue that we have open is 33464, which is unflagged import meta resolve. Guy, would you like to take this one?
Right, so we landed import.meta.resolve a little while ago, and this is basically the analog to require.resolve in CommonJS. So it's async, and one of the great things is now that we have top-level await, using import.meta.resolve in top-level code is absolutely good and fine to do. It follows all the resolver semantics, exports, etc. And we also have behavior for a trailing slash to resolve paths. One of the reasons that was added was if you want to, for example, a standard workflow for import meta.resolve or require.resolve is when you want to load an asset that isn't a module. So maybe you've got a template file or something like that. You want to know the path to load it from, and maybe it's a third-party package or something like that. So allowing this trailing slash allows resolving paths, and then you can kind of load assets from within those paths, and it's a very nice, useful convenience. There are, yeah, I mean, apart from that, there's not a lot more to it. I think the only thing that was even like a vague complexity was that sort of pathing thing. Yeah, I think that's most of it.
So yeah, I have my hand up. So I am fine with the use case, right? Like I posted another issue that's on the agenda as well about like an API for the package root directory, you know, or URL or whatever you want to call it. But so the first thing is I think CJS and ESM are both first-class module systems for the foreseeable future. We should never add a feature that makes sense for both to just one of them. Obviously, there are maybe some features endemic to the module system that only make sense in one module system, but those are the exception, not the rule. Resolution is something that is not unique to a module system. The output might be path versus URL, sync versus async, things like that. But you know, the capability is not. So I think that if we're that whatever we add here, it needs to be for both module systems. And then the second point is, I don't think we should conflate resolution with like locating things, because like maybe I'm using the wrong terms, but require.resolve always gives you something you can require. Right now, it may have like errors in it, or it may, you know, I don't know, but like there's a conceptual relationship there that we shouldn't break. Similarly, I would expect something called resolve in ESM to only give me things I can import. You know, or at least where the reason that I can't require or import it is because of some property of the code, and not, you know, yeah. Like this is sort of vague, and it gets a little sketchier when you talk about the possibility of ESM being over HTTP, but like whatever resolution rules we want to have, I think those same rules need to apply to both a resolve method and also the method that brings in a module. So being able to do package name with a slash on it, I think we shouldn't be able to resolve that unless that's an importable path, which it only would be if either they don't have exports or they add exports explicitly with a dot slash.
So I had my hand up next, and then it's Jeff. Unless, Jeff, did you have a direct response to Jordan? Because mine is a little bit tangential.
Yeah, it more or less is, I guess.
So you go first. I'll go after.
So I would say a few things is that, like, I understand that philosophically, you know, you think that things named the same should function the same, but like there are so many differences between these module systems that I'm not sure that that should really apply so like uniformly, because like require can require any file, like any unknown file extension, for example, just can be required as, and it gets treated as JavaScript whether it is or not. And obviously that's not the case with ESM. So like right off the bat, you have resolve that's resolving file, like resolve is really telling you what would this be mapped to a file on disk, and that the file exists on disk. By definition, if the file's on disk, you can require it. Node might throw an error once you do, but that's already a difference between ESM
Well, but I mean,
and
you could put
CommonJS.
JSX in a .js file and try to import it, and it will error. But the reason it errors is because it's a property of the code in the file. And I'm saying that's fine. But like you could,
really
if the code was well
authored. What you're saying though is that because resolve in CommonJS both figures out what the path should be on disk and verifies that it exists on disk, that therefore this API should do the same. But this is a different module system that uses URLs, and by it inherently is meant to potentially include HTTP URLs in the future, which you're not going to resolve to disk.
If you resolve in the ESM resolver a file that has an unknown extension, it throws in the resolver that it doesn't know the extension. It doesn't try to load the file.
Right. And similarly, even if we had HTTP modules, you'd need to load to find out its exports potentially. Like if we, you know, we haven't talked about that, but like, yeah, I mean.
My point is, like, I think the systems are quite fundamentally different, that this doesn't need to be a direct one-to-one match. And I'm not sure what users would care that this differs. You know, I understand you care because you're like an API designer and you want things to be clean, but like if we don't, then what user is going to complain and why in a real world scenario?
I mean, people file bugs on resolve all the time when it doesn't, when it produces a path that you can't require. I mean, like,
But this isn't resolve. This isn't required at resolve.
no, but
It's
it has
not
the
even the
name
same.
resolve.
So
The name, so the name means
so
something.
does
So can-
the
name.
so does the
can I-
ESM loader hook called
Quick-
resolve,
Quick
but
point
it
of
also
order.
doesn't function that way.
Quick point of order, y'all. I would love to come in with my comment that I was bringing up originally now because it is very timely. There is a what working group proposal. I just dropped the link into the chat, number 3871, specifically about making import meta, although it's .resolve URL rather than resolve. There's kind of a couple different things that I think are really important here that I would like us to all be on the same page about before we make decisions. And I'm open to being wrong here, but to me, it feels a little bit premature for us to unflag this. Well, there's still discussion about making a standardized interface upstream, at least on import meta. Import meta is a thing that's going to be shared between environments, and that's something that various environments may want to use. I noticed that, like one of the things that Guy mentioned as a motivating factor here is top level await, but top level await is still behind a flag. Now, kind of two different things here, and I've chimed in on this issue to see if what working group is interested in still exploring this. I know that other environments like Deno, I think, have implemented something like this, but a couple things that I think are worth pointing out. First, there was the like, hey, maybe we don't call it resolve, maybe we don't even call it resolve URL, and there was some kind of bike shedding around the name in here. And so Jordan, kind of to your point, like, I think that we should likely figure out how to name it, and maybe not naming it resolve would be better. Secondly, if this is a feature that we think is important to be shared between import and require, and it is premature to put it on import meta, perhaps we should consider putting it on util or somewhere else. My understanding from looking at the API, and it can be wrong, is that you're still expected to pass import meta URL to it. So maybe that's optional, but either way, like we could have util.resolve URL or something like that. That could be a node specific API that we could deprecate in the future for import. Wes raises a really great kind of speaking out of both sides here, where import meta does exist for host specific data, but we're saying not to add non-agreed upon members. Wes, to that point, I think that I would say it's subtly different. I think that this is host specific in the fact that the implementation may be specific, but that when we're talking about adding things that would be useful and potentially shared across multiple hosts, we definitely should try to coordinate. I think that's like what is specific and important from a spec perspective over at TC39 is that TC39 doesn't own this. So like to me, where I would like to see, what I would like to see, and if what working group isn't interested in this and browsers aren't interested in this, then maybe it's a non-starter. But if there is something called import meta.resolve or similar API, I would want the behavior to be the same in Node and on the browser and in Deno and in other environments, if that's something that we could do. I point to the URL object as an example here where Node has like the URL, but then we eventually adopted what working group URL, and it's a huge amount of legacy that we need to manage. So to me, where like I can see import meta resolve as we've implemented it extremely useful, I think that putting it on import meta right now doesn't seem to accomplish everything that we want to accomplish. And I would be more comfortable unflagging something that is on util or not import meta, as long as there is any possibility of standardization or collaboration between environments. If we are wanting to say, no, this is a node specific API and it's never going to exist anywhere else, and if you used it in your code, then that is absolutely node. Yeah, so Wes, to your point, if we wanted to do import meta node resolve, that could totally be something, and we could totally, in the future, deprecate that for an import meta resolve URL or whatever. I don't know that I see the advantage to doing that over like a util function if we want to share it between both environments. But I just wanted to kind of point out that as a high level of something that I would like to see us try to accomplish here. Although if that is not a goal, then fine, but we should be kind of explicit about it and try to, if possible, avoid the stamping on others people's feet, which is where I actually think import meta node resolve, even though it is a little verbose, is maybe a little bit better there.
Just to add, in terms of getting buy-in, I think this is a unique situation, and I've said it before, and I'll continue saying it, because the driving use cases for this feature exist first and foremost in server.js engines, as opposed to browser engines, due to where we are in terms of progress between the platforms. So Node.js actually has the first mover advantage on this feature, and that's why it is a different situation, and why I think the thread at Wattwerk has been stalled for 2 years. I'm going to post an issue on Dino and see if they have interest. Would getting interest between Node and Dino on the same API be enough of a buy-in to consider unflagging? I do feel that standards are meaningless without implementation adoption. When it comes down to it, the proof of a standard is in the implementation shipping. So that what we're really looking to coordinate is the platforms that want to ship this. Yeah, I would be careful being too conservative, because in a few months, users are going to start requesting these sorts of features as they want to move to ESM primarily, and it'll just be another case of, oh, we don't have a way to do this. And I think we're far enough ahead to know what our users need at this point, and we should serve our users.
So I guess the only thing I would ask to that, I think trying to coordinate with Dino would definitely alleviate some of my concern, but I'd love to figure out why it makes sense to put on import meta rather than util or something like that, if there's a strong reason.
Or module for that matter.
Yeah.
There are two reasons. One, it's contextual. You don't have to repeat import meta.url. It's contextual to the current module you're in. So it'll follow self-resolution. It'll follow all of the sort of specific resolution cases. And secondly, it's statically analyzable. What's really nice about import.meta.resolve is build tools can spot it a mile away. And actually, one of the major difficulties with optimizing Node.js applications is detecting which assets are referenced. And we did a lot of work in NCC and Node file trace with Versal to be able to do this asset detection in order to optimize Node.js deployments. And this code is used, like it's the standard way of tracing asset deployments in all deployments with Versal. Now, import.meta.resolve would basically reify this kind of an asset extraction pattern and make it straightforward. So
you can pass dynamic values into it. It's not like there's no syntactic guarantee that it's a string. So it's actually no more statically analyzable than require is. It's the same exact thing where if you choose to use a static string.
That's like saying that dynamic import is no more statically analyzable than require.
Yes. In the sense.
Require can be reassigned. That's the difference.
So
sure, but you can statically determine that in the parse tree.
Really quick point of order here before we get too deep on this. We have one more agenda item around package JSON resolution and exports that we haven't gotten to yet. Do we want to continue spending time on this item, or do we want to have some time for the package JSON discussion?
I just don't understand why people don't want to ship a feature that is useful for our users that helps them do something they can't do today. And like the static analyzability is about getting buy-in between build tools. What matters in terms of buy-in here is build tools and platforms, and import.meta.resolve very easily leads to both.
But not for all our users, only our ESM users.
Browserify or Webpack, the current Node.js built-ins are not up to date. If you're using Webpack and you do import URL, file URL to path and things like that aren't implemented, the built-ins aren't maintained. No one maintains them. Whereas these kind of very simple static syntaxes allow us to move beyond standard library static analyzability cases. And I do think that leads to simplicity that's important in adoption. But I will shut up there.
Can I just say something, Moss?
Yeah, let's
It's quick.
stick to about a minute.
I was gonna
Jan has their hand up too for a while.
What about this? Could we perhaps ship this unflagged as something that's not on import meta for now? Like whatever, import resolve URL from module. And it could behave exactly like this. I guess we'd have to take import meta as an argument, but we could just ship it. It would be out there. And then, if we can get more standardization later from Dino and elsewhere, then we can also add it to import meta, but there's no reason it can't just also stay as some utility function on our API in addition. But then it's out there and it's unflagged, and it could just be there in addition to eventually having it on import meta. Would anyone object to that? Guy, would that be better than not doing nothing?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
Say you ship it as, import resolve URL from module. So it's not on import meta, but it functions exactly the same way, except that it has to then take import meta as an argument, presumably. But we've shipped it and it's unflagged and it's documented. We would just do that now, essentially, unless there's any objection to that. And then whenever the standardization process concludes with import.meta, we could potentially also add it to there. But at least we would get it out there on flag now as some utility function.
To be clear, that addresses all my concerns. Then it's available in both module systems, and it does not have the implication that it's a resolver.
It also addresses my concerns regarding committing prematurely to something on import meta.
I know it's not as good as being something standardized on import meta, but I feel like if we can't ship that anytime soon, then might as well ship something and then add that later, if that works, Guy. Or you can think about it. Back to you, Miles.
Okay, so for now we can move on to the next issue, which is package JSON resolution and exports. Let's see who opened this issue. I can just introduce it really quickly because I think I'm pretty familiar with it, but I think the crux of this is the fact that exports does not by default include the package.json, and people keep getting bit by this. I think that there is a request from the community to perhaps change our decision about what the defaults are with exports. It is my understanding that Wes Todd has joined us today explicitly to discuss this. Wes, would you like to maybe kick off some of your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I think the original author came into the Node tooling Slack and started chatting about it, which brought it to my attention. So it's a really common practice to just say require, package JSON from, slash qualified module name slash package.json, right? From a tooling perspective, this is really ergonomic. Now, if you have a tool which is looking at the entire tree for your dependencies, and suddenly you hit one with an exports defined, you will break, right? You can't require the package JSON anymore. So I think, then to summarize, there's been a bunch of additions, like possible other solutions here in this thread, but really all of them end up putting the burden on tool maintainers to make a bunch of changes to accommodate this. And I think that since exports is new, it seems really odd to say we're going to add this new feature and it's going to break everyone. And now to fix it, everybody who has ever implemented a tool which uses require on package JSON, go update your code. It seems like that's a fairly unacceptable solution to me. Anyway, I'll stop down there. Maybe let other people talk about it.
Jan has their hand up, and then I would like to speak next. Jan?
Yeah, so I think we knew about this problem. We know that Preact, I think, and Snowpack were running into this problem. I think the pushback we are getting is not from the wide community. I wouldn't expect this to be coming from the average Node.js developer. It's an important part, but a small part of the community that is running into this. So I think there is a path to ask those few people that are writing tools that need to require package JSON to adopt the new resolution feature, just like every other tool that is interacting with package metadata needs to adjust to the new resolution feature, in the interest of the vast majority of people that could be using exports as a simple feature that is very explicit. Now, I personally don't care as much as long as we make it a very clear exemption. And the very clear exemption would be every export implicitly has a fixed and non-overridable mapping of ./package.json to ./package.json. And trying to configure that mapping would not work. It would not do anything because it's enforced for every exports field, basically. Which means that nobody can decide how that one magical specifier should resolve. It would kind of introduce a reserved specifier that has an implicit meaning, which technically makes exports a little bit more tricky to explain because there's now a footnote to a lot of sentences. But I think it might be an acceptable trade-off if it helps unblock people. So I think that's my current take.
So I'll add something really quickly, and then unfortunately we're at time and I have a hard cut. I think that exports is a new thing, and there's a lot of edge cases and things to learn. And the expectations that folks have today is definitely built upon how they've done things before. And in 6 months, a year, 2 years, those expectations just won't exist anymore. Personally, I think having caveats to the system where it's like, this rule is always true except for this one thing, actually makes educating people harder. And I'm personally not a fan of the idea of turning it on for that exact reason. I do think that we can document better, that we can have better errors, that we can make it easier for folks. But I think that if we kind of tried to paste over everything for what people's initial intuition is, we'd end up with like a much less consistent platform. It's at least where I'm coming from it right now. But I recognize that I may be not the only person I may be the only person who feels that way.
I don't think you're the only person who feels that way. And I think if there was a really great solution that had no exceptions, I'd be all for it. I think the concern here is that the situation we have now is in order for module authors to adopt this great new feature, which I think is absolutely no questionable a great addition, means that they all will have to go and put ./package.json, ./package.json, because that's the only way it's going to work with the existing tools. So if they want to go that route, we're just putting more burden on them for no real gain. Because as Jordan said, he's going to just go and add it to all his packages.
I don't think that's quite true. I don't know if someone's ahead of me.
So unfortunately, we are at time.
Oh, yeah.
And we've got to
Sorry.
stop for today. What I would suggest is let's kick it back to the issue tracker, and then for the next meeting, let's make this the first issue that we discuss, so we can actually get to it and properly discuss it. Cool.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks, everyone. Gonna go ahead and stop the stream.